the Game Gear, a machine with some amazing games that might be overlooked. Now over the years I've enjoyed playing this, modding them, and fixing up more than my fair share. But recently, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to play these on my big screen, and for that I created my own Game Gear console. So let's find out how I did it. And welcome to Goldfish on Games. This project started off like most with these machines, with a faulty Game Gear. And this one, it just turns on, then off right away. And considering that I have a fixed up stock machine, and one that's absolutely full of mods, I wanted to see something different. Game Gear games running on my CRT TV. And while the Game Gear in many ways is a portable Master System, it was upgraded with a wider colour palette than even the Mega Drive, as well as having stereo audio. But it also got a number of exclusive games. Plus, with its ability to play Master System titles, this could end up being a good way of playing them. But before we really get into this, please note, I am not an expert on anything you're about to see, and this is not a guide. This is me stumbling my way through it all. And it's quite likely that I'm doing things in weird or even completely wrong ways. So if you have any positive advice on how to improve anything, then please let me know in the comments. And with that said, let's start at the beginning, which for a Game Gear is recapping it. Every Game Gear has to be recapped, and I've done a number of them over the years, and there are a few methods, and there's a load of videos showing them off in great detail. And my preferred one? Well, sorry, it looks like I've finished the recap already, and it's gonna have to remain a mystery. Which means it's the moment of truth. Does this work? And the screen says on, it is lit. I can hear audio, so let's mess around with the contrast to see if we actually have something on the screen. And thankfully, there is. But as I continue to mess around with the contrast, I could see that there were issues with the screen. And I could see lines going through the picture. So for me, this is a good thing, as this machine would have required a new screen at an absolute minimum, so it's going to have to be modded anyway. So what's the next step? Well, it's a big one. It's trying to get video out, as there isn't just points on the board that we can get RGB or composite video directly. We need extra hardware to decode the signals that this machine produces. The funny playing driver and LCD kit seemed like a cheap way to go. So I went about stripping the parts off the board, following these instructions. And in said instructions they mention a VGA option, and if you look really closely, there is talk of a TV mode that looks like it gives you RGB video and C-Sync, which sounded exactly what I needed. But to fit this, you also had to remove the LCD, which isn't one of the easier parts of this project. But it's not the most difficult, that's fitting the driver board itself. And when I booted up the board and the LCD, all I got was this. The machine is running, as you can hear the music in the background, and I could even interact with it. But no matter how I wired it up, this corrupted screen was all I could get. So I assumed the board was faulty, and I started the refund process and decided to buy the kit I should have done in the first place. The GGTV. A board designed by Tim Worthington, and it does exactly what I wanted. To give composite as well as RGB video out of the Game Gear. The downside? Well, it cost more and I had to order it from Australia, so it took much longer to arrive. The instructions are a little basic, as it's really just a single picture showing you where to solder onto the Game Gear, and a diagram of the mod board with the pins labelled. Where those points are will depend on the Game Gear version that you're using, and currently this is a VA0, also known as a 2-chip. Now outside of a few tricky points to solder to, like the legs of one of the chips, it wasn't the worst thing I've ever done. and with the inputs soldered to the right hand side, I could then solder the output to the left. For this, I'm using a Mega Drive 2 style video connector, as it has all the pins for composite, RGB and stereo audio. And if I follow the pinout for the Mega Drive 2, I should be able to use its cables. But as a first step, let's just connect the ground and the composite wires. You'll also need to wire up the enable pad, as it's required to turn it on, and it just has to be connected to ground. And with the power board connected, let's see if we have a picture. And wow, it just worked! This is amazing! Let's try hooking up the audio pins, which I'm going to take directly from the audio cable, so we don't have to bother with anything else. And we have sound! This is so awesome! Honestly, this was the first time I started this up as well. And after all the pain of the funny playing board, I was expecting to have a real fight with this one. But no, it did just start up. And I guess the next thing to do is to hook up the RGB wires, as well as the 5V power. That will tell it to enable the RGB mode, as well as auto switch to the right channel. And whoa, that is such a clear picture. It might be a little oversaturated, but it is so clean. And with that, we have video and audio. So I guess the next step has to be controls? Adding a controller is tricky, as I can't just use a Master System pad, as the Game Gear expects 3 buttons, and this pad, it just has 2. The third one is on the console itself. Now a Mega Drive pad, that should have been perfect with its 4 buttons, but they used a few tricks to put 10 pins worth of data into 9, and decoding that is currently outside of my skill set. So my solution? Well, it was to modify a Mega Drive pad, as there are enough pins for 3 buttons. And this was the result. The chip and resistors were removed and stored safely, so this can be reversed. I've then connected some jumper wires between where those buttons came into the chip to where I wanted them to go out to the connector, which for the most part is still following the Atari or Sega Master System standard. The main change is the start button is now going down pin 7, where before that was used to make it select which of the buttons it was going to read. And the way that this all works is that the buttons on the Game Gear are actually these pads. One side of them is ground, and the other is held high and connected to the Game Gear itself. Now when a conductive pad is pressed against it, it makes a connection. To hook up the controllers, we need to flip it over to the other side, where there are some conveniently placed capacitors that connect to the live side of the pad. And I've joined these to the controller port, so now when I press a button on it, it will pull that line to ground, and thus it will complete the circuit. And with that all in place, it's time to test it out. And the start button seems to work. Both A and B allow you to jump. And the D-pad moves us around. I'm shocked at how well this is all coming together. Yeah, it's a mess of wires, and I really need to put some heat shrinking in there and try and tidy it all up, but it actually works! With all of this coming together, it now needed a shell to live in, and I decided it was time to put my relatively new 3D printer through its paces. That also meant that I had to design something as well, which felt daunting until I realised that the level editor that I've been using to make CS2 maps, Hammer 2, could be used with a bit of effort for 3D modelling for printing. Now I needed to use something like Blender to convert between the various formats that everything expected, but somehow it all worked. And with an admission like that, I think you'll all believe me when I say I'm no expert and this video is not a guide. I had a few objectives in mind when I was designing this. First, it needed to look like a console, and not like a Game Gear without the screen. This meant the power switch and controller port had to be up front, and the power input and video needed to be at the back. And while I like front-loading machines like the Neo Geo, I wanted the cart to stick up out of the top of it, just like a Mega Drive or a SNES. So after lots of sketches, measuring sizes of everything, and even using photos as textures, I was able to lay everything out and in theory line up all the screw holes as well as where the various ports should be. And I think I designed something at least I considered cool, and not just a basic box. But printing it, that was a whole other ballgame, as it seemed my Cobra 2 Neo was set to banana mode? But after some advice from my fellow YouTubers, I was able to do a lot of maintenance on the printer, and I finally got a test board printed. This was a quick 2-hour print to just see if I had the screw holes in place, which not all of them were, but it was amazing to see the basic layout in person, and after fixing up a few of the smaller issues, I spent the whole day fighting with the printer. But I finally managed to get the bottom shell printed. This meant that I could then start placing the parts, and first up had to be the power. And for that I'm actually going to use the original recapped power supply. But because I didn't want the switch at the back, this isn't a CD32, I desoldered the original one and then connected a new one via some wires so it could sit at the front. And it will slot nicely into the grooves that I designed in the shell. Now there is a bit of give in either direction, but if it annoys me then a touch of hot glue would definitely fix that. The controller port ended up being a much tighter fit, so it looks like it shouldn't need any other work. Well, apart from tidying up the cables, cable management was never my strong point. But before we can fit everything else into the shell, we're going to have to disconnect the GGTV, as it's going to go up to the top of the case, and the wires that I have on it currently are not long enough. So let's get that sorted now. The video connector also has its own little box where it fits nice and snug, and now being much closer to the GGTV video ports, I can cut these wires down and have it also looking neater. And as we're doing all this other work, let's tackle the controller port at the same time. And with all that done, I think this is actually looking quite cool. And it's possibly the best thing that I've ever modded. But there is still more. As I stated, I wanted the cart to stick up out the top, and currently it's pointing to the back of the shell. My solution for this is the Retro 6 Game Slot GG. This is a 2-part solution for replacing the cart slot in the Game Gear. And it's joined together by a ribbon cable. And to fit this, we're going to have to remove the old cart slot. First by removing the holding lugs on either side of it, and then cutting the pins on the slot. We could desolder them, and then just remove it all intact, but doing it this way will give us something to solder onto. Even if heating those old pins do make them want to fall out. And with that in place, let's check to make sure it all still works, with the supplied cable and slot. And thank goodness it does. I was really worried that after all that snipping and soldering, that it was not going to work. So I'm really relieved that I've not broken anything. Now the supply cable, it's a little short for what I had in mind, so I want to now test out this longer one. Which also, thankfully, just works. My plan is not to use this cart slot directly, but to replace it with something custom, which took a few attempts, designing something in hammer. The first version wasn't too bad. It seemed to be around about the right size, and it held the edge connector in place. But the screw holes weren't lined up, and those tabs, well, they were a little bit too far in, and it clashed against the cart itself. The second revision fixed those issues, and I even added this bar to help guide the cart in, as well as giving me more area to glue to when I affixed this to the top of the shell. But it ended up being a bit too tight of a fit width-wise, and while it worked great for regular games, my flash cart wouldn't boot unless I pushed it at an angle. So I ended up with this third revision, with the sides being pushed out slightly by 0.5 mm and then a wedge being added to the bottom to push the cart into the pins. And with all that working, it was time to glue it into place on the top of the shell, where I actually even placed some guides so I knew exactly where it would line up with the hole that was already in place. Although thinking about it, it might have been better if I screwed this into place instead. Now what would be a console without a power LED, so I had to add one. And for this I decided to wire it straight up to the test pads that were on the game slot GG, as it made things a little bit easier. And also because I wanted to do something a little bit cooler with it as well. So while it's playing Game Gear games, it will show up as red. But when we play a Master System game, it will go to yellow. This was achieved using an RGB LED, with the red light going to the regular 5 volts, and the green light, well, it goes to the SMS pad. That will give 5 volts when it's in that mode. Now both use a resistor to bring the voltages down to the right amount. So with all the basics done, it's time for the big reveal. And I'm really happy with how this turned out. I went with a satin black for the colour, trying to ape the other consoles that Sega were putting out at the time. And I tried to give it some nods to the Game Gear itself, with that bit around the top being similar to the shape of the cart. And I did try to get this as smooth as possible. But considering my cheapo printer really did not produce the best results, I think this turned out better than I could have hoped for. It wires up just as you'd expect from a console of the 90s. Power. Video. Controller. The cart just clicks into place nicely, and then it boots like you'd expect from a console of the time. And it is glorious. But there is one thing I didn't point out earlier, but I think it's quite obvious, and that is the GGTV will only give a smaller image for Game Gear games, as it ran natively at 160 by 144 resolution. And that doesn't really scale nicely to the more standard 320 by 240 resolutions. And I think this is why the other kits tend to use VGA, so they can scale it up to resolutions that VGA monitors are more likely to accept. But it's not a deal breaker, as you do get used to it after a while, particularly with that beautiful clear image. And it was just lovely playing some of my Game Gear games with a decent pad on this TV. Compatibility was no issue, as it even supported the weird Codemasters cart that they designed for their golf game. It's a much chunkier thing. and it's the only game that I have that you can't read the label from the front. And all that girth? Well, that was for their 64-bit graphics chip that they had inside, whatever that meant. Due to it only having a Game Gear slot, and that the Master System's Game Gear converter doesn't really fit anymore, it is limited to playing SMS games via a flash card. But in my testing, I've not noticed any real issues, and the games, they looked great, and they all run at their own regular resolution. So it fills the screen as you would expect. And I think this might be clearer than my Master System 1, and it might be almost as good as my Mega Drive with SMS converter. But what makes this better is that having the pause button on the controller is really useful, as there are a number of games that use that for extra functionality, so I no longer have to reach over to the console to press it to activate these various effects. It's really quite nice being able to play games from both systems on a single device, and on my TV, as it is interesting to see the changes that some games had. For most, yeah, they were just quick and easy ports between the two platforms, but for others, they had completely different levels, or completely remade games. Now, there's no clear and simple rule to say which system had the better version of a game, and because I know I'll be asked if I don't show it off, the TV tuner, it doesn't work with this setup. I think there's actually a dedicated pin for it, and it's not hooked up to any of these modern kits. But to be honest, it's a little less useful here when it's connecting to a TV that already has its own RF tuner and composite input. Audio was a bit of a thing, as originally I was taking it directly from the Game Gear mainboard, as that was just the quickest way to get it going. And it also meant one less thing to be packed inside of the shell. But as I was using it, I realised that it was a lot quieter than all my other machines, and there was some amount of noise as well on the signal. So I experimented with hooking up the amp board, and I think it might actually be better with it in, even if I don't actually have anywhere dedicated for it to live inside the case. So that is something I'll have to think about for a version 2, as is adding that microcontroller to handle the inputs, so I wouldn't have to use a modded controller. And that might make it easier to add a second player controller, as the link up port not only allowed you to link up 2 Game Gears for 2-player games, but it also had all the pins for a second controller when it was running in Master System mode. It also might have been a good idea to have more than one screw holding it all together. The case is quite tight and it mostly holds itself together, but extra support? That might have been a good idea. And if I was redesigning all of this to make space for the audio board, then I might also have moved the GGTV, as it really should have been a lot closer to the clock source on the motherboard, as it's very easy to cause interference on that wire when it gets close to other ones. Although this entire project was a huge learning curve, as I've not really done anything like this before, and while it was frustrating at times, it was also a lot of fun, and I've really been enjoying the final result, so really I wouldn't have had it any other way. But there is one last thing. A sticker. I dub you the Goldfish Games Gear console. The silliest name that I could think of. May you play all the games for years to come. And if you enjoyed this content, then I'm sorry to say that I don't tend to do many hardware modding videos. I mostly do game reviews, checking out magazines, and looking at Amiga stuff. But I have covered some Master System and Game Gear games in the past, and I might have to cover a few more in the future. So if that does sound interesting, then consider the buttons under the video, as they will let you know when new videos come out. And it will also let YouTube know that you enjoyed it. or of course you can drop me a comment. And until next time, I was the Goldfish, that was the Goldfish Games Gear console, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thanks for watching. I had so much fun with this project. Yes, it took a good few months to come together, but I think the end result was worth it. And if you did enjoy it, then there should be 2 other videos on the screen right now that you could go check out. Hopefully one of them will take your interest, and I'll see you again in another video.